Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church, and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation and not necessarily change your mind prior to listening. You can contact us as well by email ogc@accessradio.biz, biz is spelled B-I-Z. That's ogc@accessradio.biz. So please enjoy today's guest, who was for 14 years a software developer regarding the internet, before hanging up his mouse and all things binary to become a traditional Presbyterian minister. Our guest started his life in Montana, but is now based in Austin, Texas, having hung up his weekly sermons and pouring out love on a Sunday to pouring out beer from his brewery he now owns. So why did he give up software to become a minister? Why did he give up the bread and non-alcoholic wine, presumably, on a Sunday for a 7-day-a-week beer-making company? What negativity was verbally thrown at him by Christians when starting his brewery? What did his family think? What was it like being brought up by his grandparents, and what effect has this had on him? What has he learned so far about God and himself in his journey so far? All these questions, so many answers no doubt coming our way. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Christian Cryder. Christian, thank you so much. And in that introduction, I never even mentioned your new CD that you got out, called In the Wilderness. No doubt you can give a plug about that later on. How are you keeping, good sir?
I am doing well. Thank you, Martin.
Great stuff. Well, before we go into those questions, here we go, 5 questions as well that gives a better understanding of who you really are, or maybe not.
Yeah.
Question number 1. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be?
Martin Luther and his wife, Katie. Katie was a brewer. Martin Luther was a famous reformer who loved Katie's beer. I think it would be very enjoyable to have an evening conversation with him.
Definitely. I mean, there are loads of controversial things that we could discuss about Martin Luther. You no doubt would bring them up to see what he thinks about it in today's environment. But I'd love to know more about how much of it is a myth and how much of it is fact that Katie was in fact one of the license holders for brewing beer.
She was in fact a brewer, and I mean, we know this. She actually was basically, as a nun, one of the skills she learned was brewing beer. When she married Martin and left the nunnery, she actually managed and ran kind of the household. And one of the things that she was famous for was her beer, so much so that we've got instances where people are writing to Martin Luther saying, hey, we'd like you to come speak. By the way, can you bring some of Katie's beer with you? So you could argue that Katie Luther funded the Reformation.
I have heard that mentioned by somebody else. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? That beer was the way to go for Martin.
Well, he used to preach with a beer too.
Oh, really?
I think this is one of the things I appreciate about Martin Luther is that he was a character and he wasn't afraid to be a character. And we live in a culture that is hungry for characters, but we're afraid of being our own character. And so whether you like him or dislike him, I think it's always interesting to find somebody who is not afraid to be themselves in their skin, in their time and place. And he's an example of somebody that God used.
Yeah. Well, I often mention if I had my time machine, we'd go back and do such and such. So if you and I got in my time machine and went back to meet Martin and Katie, where the brewery is, what do you think the beer would have tasted like then compared to the beer that we know now?
Well, listen, let's be honest. We are very romantic and nostalgic about the early beer. Brewers didn't even know that yeast existed at that point. They just knew that if you put the ingredients into this thing and you happen to have some of the previous like foam and stuff from the last time you brewed, it would start all over again. So the short answer is the quality of beer was all over the map back then. You might have a batch that was incredibly great, and then a few days later, because they didn't really understand sanitation, that batch might be terrible. And gradually over time they were learning, but I think they were getting glimpses of how great beer can be at its best. But our beer now is probably the best it's ever been in the history of the world, just in terms of what we understand and the quality and our access to different styles from all over the world. So yeah, it's better now.
Has she got a particular recipe that we now know of and say, hey, that would have been a good beer?
Are you saying, do we have any or do I have any from that time?
Both then, really, then, yeah.
So I don't have any. One of the things we don't do is, we don't like dig up old recipes and try to just reproduce those. But we do have a beer called Katie's Pride. It's an Oktoberfest beer. It's a Märzen, and it's a fabulous beer. We brew it during end of September, early October. That would be a classic German style of beer. Martin would love it.
5 ingredients then. Am I right in saying that? A German beer normally just has 5?
Well, what they say, it's barley, water, hops. And the old law, the purity law, didn't yet account for yeast. It's simpler than that. It's really no fruit. The Germans are all like, oh, the Belgians are crazy. They stick fruit in their beers and they do wild fermentations and stuff like that. German brewing classically has been very simple, very straightforward, very few ingredients: barley, water, hops, yeast. They stretch on some of the styles that they do now. So there's an amazing range of styles. Germany has its particular, it adds its flavor to the world of brewing. You've got Belgium that has strongly influenced their tradition. But really, over the last 20 years, I got to say, America has been driving a lot of the developments in the beer world around the world. But as a friend of mine once said, it's like there would not have been a craft beer revolution without Christians, without the monks and nuns who for 1,000 years were the commercial brewers of the world.
Well, before we go to question 2, and let's just clear it out once and for all, that's
Yep.
all right. So we can talk about more important things. If we go back in time again, obviously we'd have to learn to speak Martin's language and stuff like that. If we mentioned to him that it's a big divisive issue in the 20th century and 21st century that Christians shouldn't drink alcohol, you and I obviously are the exception to that, and quite a few others, what do you think he would say?
I think Martin would probably say that's a classic example of religion trying to control our lives in ways that are not prescribed by the scriptures. So one of the things, Martin has all of his faults, but one of the greatest things that he did was actually drive people back to the text and to say, let's go read the Bible for ourselves. And what you find out when you read the Bible is that the Bible is not actually anti-alcohol. Alcohol is a gift from God. When Jesus is at the wedding of Canaan, he doesn't turn the water into grape juice. He turns the water into wine, and it's the good stuff. So much so that everybody is amazed when he does it. And I think that Martin would point out that in our religious zeal, we often substitute simpler things or easy things in place of the hard things. It's much easier for me to look in the mirror and say, you know what? If I don't drink alcohol, God must love me. It's a lot harder to say what God really desires for me is to love him, heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to live for him, and to walk by faith, and to learn to trust. That's actually really hard. So I think Christians, and particularly religious people, it's very easy to start trying to make religion, or our religion, something that makes our faith easier for us. And I think Martin would say, no, we actually need to believe that Jesus's grace and Jesus's love is all that we need in order to be right with God. And that actually gives us great liberty to enjoy, but not be controlled by some of these other things.
Great answer. Thank you very much indeed. Question 2. Who is your favorite biblical character or favorite biblical story or favorite parable, please, young sir?
I would have to say that I love the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. It's a classic example. It's in John chapter 4. It's right after John chapter 3, where Jesus has just encountered a religious person, Nicodemus, who most religious people would look at and say, surely this guy is well on his way to like knowing God. And Jesus actually says, you haven't even gotten started. And then in the very next chapter, he encounters this woman who would not just have been rejected by Jewish people. She was a Samaritan, but she's actually been rejected by her own people. She's an outcast among outcasts. And she has got a track record like nobody else. She's been married to 5 guys. The guy she's living with now is not her husband. And Jesus actually engages her in a way that meets her on her own turf He speaks language that she can understand. There's actually a lot of provocative things that he's saying in that passage. And basically the text is inviting us to say, this is the kind of person that's actually close to God, or God is drawing close to this kind of person. And you say, my goodness, how is that possible? God is not close to this super religious person, and yet he's drawing close to this person who looks very irreligious in a lot of ways. And I think that, to me, is the beauty of the gospel, in that it's very, very provocative and challenging about who God is and how he meets us and what it takes for us to connect to him.
This is going to be some podcast. I can just feel it. I can feel it in me bones. Question 3. You can be Prime Minister if you want, or you can be President of the USA. Not that that would ever be topical. If you're either of those two, for a day, and could change any law or impose new law, Christian Cryder, what would it be, please?
Well, listen, if I got to be Prime Minister and I could miraculously get a British accent, I would obviously choose that, because that's very, very cool. I tend to be pretty jaded about politics. So, in other words, that's a hard question to answer.
You can be frivolous. There you go.
Okay, so here's what I would do. I'd be like, everybody needs to chill out, and they need to have a beer with whoever they're going to demonize or castigate. They need to sit down and have a beer with them first. And then when they get up to say something about their opponent, they need to be able to start with one thing that they actually like or appreciate about that person.
Well, you've got my vote on that. Absolutely brilliant. But you know what's going to happen, don't you? Someone will say, yes, but I don't like beer. Well, have an orange juice then.
Yeah, that's right.
Whatever.
We've got coffee, we've got beer, we've got tacos.
Oh, I don't eat spicy food. And then you could just carry on doing a Monty Python sketch as a result of that, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Missing the point entirely, which actually could be very, very true about so many scriptures, how people just completely misunderstand the point of what has been said. Thank you. Good answer. I'm going to vote for you as president if I ever become American myself. What has been your most embarrassing moment to date so far then, please, young sir?
You know, we try to bury these things when embarrassing things happen. What's your audience like? They might be very offended.
No.
You sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is one of my earliest moments of great embarrassment.
Go for it.
So my parents had just divorced. I was in 5th grade, living with my grandparents in California. My grandparents have been empty nesters for a while. My grandfather is an ex-Marine, chain pipe smoker, salty. He was constantly like cussing. He's like, hell, Chris. And I'm like, my name's Christian. And he's like, hell, Chris. He was just himself. And I really, really loved and appreciated him dearly. My grandparents took me to SeaWorld, which is the ocean aquarium down in San Diego. And we were in SeaWorld, and I'm still like reeling from the grief of my parents' divorce, but I've never been any place like this. And there's this giant aquarium where you can look from the glass on the outside, and the fish are swimming inside, but there's a whale that is swimming. You know, the crowd's standing around. We're all looking at this. And there's my grandfather smoking his pipe. You could still smoke in public back then. And like, there's this big whale. He had to be 20 feet long. And you know how whales or fish, big fish, sometimes get these little small fish that suck onto them?
Yes.
And so I knew what those fish were. And you'd see some fish, but the tails always point backwards. So this giant whale is swimming around. I'm in 5th grade. And there is a sucker fish stuck on him, but he's pointing the wrong direction. He's about 2/3 of the way back. And this fish had to be 2 feet long, but it was pointing into the current. I'm like, Grandpa, what's that? And my grandpa just smokes his pipe, doesn't say anything. Fish goes around, whale goes around again. And I'm like, Grandpa, what's that? And he doesn't say anything. And I think he must not be seeing it. And so finally, on the 3rd time around, this whale with the backwards pointing fish swims by. And I'm like, Grandpa, what's that thing right there? And he goes, hell, Chris, it's his dinger. And I immediately turned 7 shades of purple as a 5th grader in public. So that's one of the most embarrassing things. And I told you probably wouldn't want to hear it. But if we were hanging out and drinking beer, I'd definitely tell you that story.
Well, I have to say, it's not the most embarrassing one we've ever heard yet. It's very good.
There you go.
And well done you for using the word dinger. That's a first.
That's what he said. I am just quoting from the source.
Very good. Thank you. And finally, the last question on these before we get into the main frame, as it were. Outside of family events, young Christian, what has been your most enjoyable day out to date, please?
I mean, there's a lot to try to choose from. I'm going to give you my most enjoyable date in the last year.
Go for it. That's good enough.
I try to take about 3 to 4 weeks off every summer to go back to Montana to go fishing. And I spend about 3 weeks straight during that. We see our grandkids. I'm from Montana, so I love it. I fish. My son has built a boat. Sometimes he can come with me, but I fish in a drift boat. So fly fishing on a river, the Bighorn River in Montana. It's a world-class fly fishing river. And one of the things that I absolutely love doing is fishing for great big trout that are sipping on dry flies. And I cuss like a sailor when I do because they are so infuriating. But every now and then you get the perfect cast, the perfect drift, just the right fly, and the fish eats it. And this past summer, I've met an older gentleman on the river. We started fishing together, and he actually paid me a huge compliment when he said very few people like to fish the way he likes to fish, which is just, you can take hours to float 2 miles, and you're going just like every little bit on the bank looking as you float down for these rising fish. And oftentimes the closer you get to the bank, the bigger the fish are.
Mm-hmm.
And so you will see a nose, just the tip of a nose. And there was one fish in particular that was under this bush, and we had seen him several days. He called him Walter. He's like, that's Walter, and that's his cave. And we would sit there, and it was an impossible cast because the bush is leaning out about 3-4 feet over the water. There's branches in the water above it, branches in the water below it, and you could see this nose just chomping, but he's back in there. So you can't like cast it above and then drift it down. You have to literally land it on the water about 6 inches above him in this little hole, and you're trying to cast to that 35 feet away. It's an impossible cast. If I try that 100 times, I'm not going to make that cast. And of course, my friend is like, but you got to try it. And so I get out of the boat, and he filmed this. On my second cast, I landed it right in the hole, and Walter ate it, and I set the hook and lost him. That moment, just touching that fish, I will carry that with me the entire year. So when I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas, and as hot as blazes, and I'm thinking about Montana, I go back to that scene on the river with Walter in his cave.
You see, I thought every American would just get the gun out and shoot it.
Yeah, we do that too.
The archetypal American. Bit like in the Indiana Jones film in the very first episode.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
I don't know whether it's true, but Harrison Ford, I think, had too many orange juices the night before. And he'd been practicing for months this amazing trick that he was going to do where the bloke comes out with a sword and all he had was the rope. And he was going to do these incredible things, you know, with the rope and everything else. Because of the orange juice the night before, he just goes up to Steve Spielberg and says, look, I've got a bit of a headache. Why don't I just shoot him? And that's how it came about. There you go. Anyway, you've already mentioned about your grandma and your grandpa.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like growing up knowing that your parents were divorcing, and how old were you at the time?
Well, I mean, yeah, that you are diving right into the deep end. So first of all, I only lived with my grandparents for a year, but when my parents divorced, I was the oldest of 4, and it happened the summer of 1979. So I had just turned 10. During that summer, my first backpacking trip into the mountains with my dad. A week later, we survived a small plane crash down in Idaho. And then the week after that, my mom sat me down on the couch. So that would have been mid-July. And she said, I'm leaving. Your father, I'm getting divorced. Your siblings, sister and 2 brothers, they're too little to really understand, so they're coming with me, but you're old enough to make a choice. So who do you want to stay with, your dad or me? And I couldn't really stay with my dad because he was still a traveling salesman on the road. But I was like, I'm staying with dad. That was the middle of July. By the end of August, she was gone. And she remarried 5 days, 2 weeks, something like that after she left. So it was very, very rapid. My world went from, at the end of May, we're a happy family. At the end of August, I'm on my way to California to live with my grandparents. My dad's on the road and my mom is married to another guy. Probably one of the most traumatic events that has shaped my life. That was also for my 10th birthday. My grandmother gave me a copy of The Lord of the Rings, which was interesting because that became a major touchstone through my younger years, like junior high, high school, college. Read it over and over and over again. Tolkien actually coins a word called eucatastrophe, which didn't exist until he used it. And it literally means the good catastrophe. And what he was talking about was in literature, you actually find this thing where like the world goes to and people are dying. And in the great stories, you have these traumatic events, and yet at some point, like good comes out of them. And it's not simply because you won. It's not the Hollywood thing. It's not the happy ending. Oftentimes it's with tons of pain and grief. And yet your heart goes, this was worth it. And I think for me, when I look back at that period of that divorce and kind of the catastrophe that came of that, that would really haunt me probably for most of my life. But it has actually been a source of immense good as I've had to process all the things that I felt and all the things that it did to me and the things that I did as a result of it. And it shaped who I have become now and how I understand the gospel.
Interesting. The reason I asked that question is that my parents divorced when I was 16.
Okay.
We just moved from one side of the country to the other. And then 3 weeks later, my dad walked out. So I know what...
It's devastating.
It has had an effect on me. You were 10, you say. I was 16. So I suppose I had a bit more nous on me at the time. But even so, I was in a different area. And fortunately for me, I had music and football to go to keep me going. What, as a 10-year-old, what did you have to fall on apart from the book?
I started reading. I actually have this very distinct memory of the day my mom left for good. And we were standing on the porch and she gave me a hug, said she'd write. And then she turned to my dad, and the guy that she was leaving with is out in the street in our 1970-something red Datsun station wagon. The kids are in the back. And my mom looks at my dad and says, I think I'm making a mistake. And then she got in the car and drove off. So a lot of what happened next was me just going, okay, somehow this has got to come back together. It's like a bomb's gone off and you're just going, so it's like I started praying. I became much more, like, dear Lord. But everything was about, how is this going to come back together? And I also escaped into books. And I started going, I want a world where there's a happy ending. And starting to like read. And so I touched on something in The Lord of the Rings that actually turned out to be very, very poignant, but also very, very rare. So most of the books I read were like, okay, well, that was nice, but it wasn't The Lord of the Rings. And it's really just a story. And then gradually, it was probably in my junior high years, I started actually reading the Bible more. And I'm like, here is a story that, unlike all the other stories, it actually has a great hero, kind of like The Lord of the Rings. But this book actually claims to be true. And I'm like, if that is the case, if this Jesus person is true and he has this kind of power, that would change everything. So that kind of drove me into, I would say, kind of my early faith years of really starting to put on Christianity for myself.
Thank you for sharing this. Very quickly, just to wrap it all up before we can go into another, maybe uncharted water.
Yep.
Whatever happened to your dad, whatever happened to your mum, and whatever happened to your siblings, please?
I tell people my family looks like a football play. You need a whiteboard to draw it all up. So my mom remarried and had 3 more children, and then she divorced and remarried again. And so my stepdad on that side now is currently kind of slowly dying from it's like vascular dementia. And my dad remarried about a year later, and my stepmom already had 2 children that she had adopted. So now I'm the oldest of 9, counting steps and halves. One of my half brothers committed suicide a while back. And so really I'm the oldest of 8. And my family is very, very messy. Yeah, so that's the short answer. And you thought we were talking about breweries.
I did. We will get to that. I will get to that. I can just see Mr. and Mrs. Angry of Purley and Surrey writing letters as we speak. How dare you talk about beer and brew? Oh, wait a minute. This bloke's been going through what I've gone through. So looking at that aspect, when it comes to empathy, it's as if you've got more letters to your name that you can empathise with people who are going through things. When did you actually realise that actually all the past hurts that you've been carrying, they are really immense hurts, could actually be used for God's good so that you can actually be there as a listening ear? When did you realize that this is what I wanted to do?
Man, you really are asking. You're like going to the deep end. This is actually the good stuff. This is way more interesting than the brewery. The brewery is pretty incidental.
Yeah.
I will say, so I'm going to give you the very short version, which is interesting because I'm talking about this very thing when I share my story in church this Sunday. When I was a teenager, so several years after my mom left, I concluded that the reason my mom left my dad was because she was not religious enough. She wasn't committed enough to God. Even though we were a Christian family, we went to church, she sang in the choir. But I was like, if she had been more committed, she would not have left my dad. She would not have left me. She would not have had the affairs. So therefore, I'm going to build my life to make sure that this never happens to me. I'm going to actually build my life around trying to find a woman who will never leave me like my mom did. And I am going to build my life around being the most committed Christian person I can possibly be. I'm going to be the opposite of my mom. And I was actually deeply influenced by a youth pastor in junior high and high school who encouraged us to take our faith very seriously. God's alive. He wants to use you. And it's good stuff. But when you start to put your hope and your commitment, it's very easy to become a person that feels religiously oppressive to other people. So I'd be like, hey, Martin, if I can get up and read my Bible at 6 a.m. every morning, why can't you? Get with the program, be more committed. And that crushes people. I went to college. I got into Stanford. I got into MIT. I got accepted at West Point. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to any of those places. I'm going to a Bible college so I can serve God. My dad was like, oh my goodness, what? Got a zealot on my hands. All of that, I met my wife. I did not end up going into ministry right away. I went into software. When I was in seminary in Philadelphia, this would be my mid to late 30s, somewhere in there, I actually came very, very close to blowing up my own marriage.
Why?
I found myself on the verge of an affair, and this other person probably didn't know anything about it, but I found myself going, I'm deeply attracted to this other person that's not my wife. So what do? You commit. So I read my Bible and I pray and I try hard to fight against the flesh. But all of that commitment, it wasn't changing it. It wasn't fixing it. And there had actually been a pattern of struggling with, just temptation and lust and all of those things all through our lives, or through my life. And what I realized, I remember a very specific day when I realized that if something doesn't change, I am going to make a pass at this person. And either she is going to reject me, in which case it's all going to come out, or she won't reject me, in which case it's going to end up being even worse, and it'll come out later. What happened was I had this epiphany. I built my entire life trying not to be my mom. And here I am on the very verge of being my mom. And I realized that both irreligion and religion lead to the same place. They can't tame a wayward heart. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge epiphany for me. So I actually went home and I confessed everything to my wife. And my wife, I'm summarizing massively here, but my wife was devastated. But then she said, Christian, I love you, not because you're a great husband, but because you're my husband. And we're going to get through this. And what I suddenly realized was what she was modeling for me is that love doesn't flow based on performance. It actually flows based on relationship. She didn't say, if you are faithful to me and do all this, then I will love you. She actually said, because we're in this relationship together, we're going to get through this because I'm already in it and I love you. Yeah. We had a relationship. Here was the woman who would never leave me. I've been married to her my entire life. except I didn't really understand it. And what happened is when I realized how much she loved me, that actually melted something in my heart towards her that made the other thing look like, oh my goodness, what was I thinking? That was dumb. That was fake. That was fluff. Something clicked. And I said, oh my goodness, what if this is how God loves us? Where it actually starts with this relational thing. And I think this is really what grace is. It's truth and grace, where it's like, I don't love you because you're a great person. I love you because I chose you and I'm in this relationship with you. And what that means is we're going to have to deal with your and guess what? It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
But guess what? You're really loved. So I know we can work through this together, and it's costly. And so I think really for me, my wife modeled grace. Number one, it changed my life. That was the first place where I started to find change and power. Paul talks about the things that wage war within us, the lust of the flesh. And it was like, for the first, my commitment had never touched those. It could just kind of dampen them. This was the first thing that actually changed me deep down in my heart, the desires of my heart. And it actually allowed me to enter a whole different kind of relationship with my wife where like there was nothing. I could tell her everything and she wouldn't walk away from me. It was like, whoa, that is amazing. And then what happened was right about that time, I started in Philadelphia. We were living in the city. Philadelphia is not a very Christian city. And I would hang out in coffee shops doing a lot of studying. And I meet a lot of people that were not Christian. They were gays, they were Jewish, they were pagans. Before I had looked down on all those people. And what happens is when you come face to face with the fact that like, this is who I am. I'm a person who could cheat on my wife. Ugh. Well, it's really hard to look down on anybody else and think you're better than them when you've actually seen yourself. I started just going, man, I'm really interested in knowing people. And I found that I really liked them. And instead of trying to tell them about Jesus, I would try to just learn more about them. And they would ask me about myself. And I'm like, I don't know about you, but I'm a mess. But here's what's happening. God is changing me. And instead of telling them, here's what you need, it was more me talking about, here's what I'm finding. And this gospel thing, this Christianity thing, this is the only place I've ever found change or transformation. And all of a sudden, I found I was becoming friends with all these people that were not church people. And they were coming to my house, and some of them became Christians. And I started realizing these are the folks I love to hang out with. This is who I want to plant churches for.
Wow, Christian, thank you. And I will be honest to you as well now, because you did say to me, what's your audience like? It's a lot different to what it was 18 months ago when I lost 40% of my audience overnight, I reckon.
Tell me about that.
Well, I will. And then you can tell me what you think, because I had an incredible bloke on who was a Baptist minister. It won't be too difficult to find out now, giving this clue away. And he set up an organisation called livingout.org. And basically what it was, he and a few other ministers in England realised that they were same-sex attracted. But he also worked out as well that if he was going to continue his ministry, marriage, he believed, because of what it says in the Bible, was between man and woman. So it meant, therefore, that he couldn't get married and he would do his best for God as to what happened. But I noticed that as soon as that podcast went out, and there's a certain time, so I've got a rough idea where it is in the world, and as soon as that podcast went out, zoom, down it went. 40% overnight, lost the audience. So that's my side of the story. What do you think of what I've just shared with you then about, hey, I've lost some of my audience, that's one thing, but another thing is that there was a minister who was prepared to speak what he actually believed.
So this is where, number one, sorry you lost 40% of your audience. I hope you get it back. You know, one of the dangers of podcasts or writing or anything that's for an audience, it becomes very easy to measure our worth and our identity based on the size of the audience and how people respond. And so it's probably good sometimes to have people bail on us because it reminds us that we shouldn't really be putting our trust in that anyway. But that doesn't make it any easier. So that's my first thought. It's probably good for you. even though it's probably not what you want. The second thing is, I think one of the things about people of faith, there is something about religion that we put it on and it actually makes us oftentimes less honest. And if anything, when you read the Apostle Paul, you find he is incredibly liberated and he feels very free to talk about everything that he's done. And I think when we really understand the gospel, there is a freedom to be honest about the darkness within it. Because really the gospel, this is where Christianity is so unique. It comes and says, almost every other faith is like, here's the problem, and it points somewhere else. Politics does the same thing. The gospel comes and says, here's the problem, and it points into the mirror. And it says, you are actually far worse than you ever thought you were. Not just your bad stuff, but also your self-righteousness, your piety, but you're also more loved than you ever thought you could possibly be. And somehow when you start to really understand how loved you are and how costly it was for Jesus to love me, that's what starts to change me, and it starts to allow you to be honest. So, I don't know this person you're talking about, but I appreciate the honesty, and I think we need more of it. And I think one of the things that I've found is, even with me sharing my story, I am going to actually not shrink from my story, because that's the place where God has actually met me the most clearly. But it's been really interesting. Some people respond tremendously because they too have dark stories. But I've had other people who are like, hey, appreciate you sharing that, but could you tone that down? I literally had one guy once say, like, I really don't want my kids hearing about that, because I want to be able to point to the pastor as a person that they can respect and emulate. And I'm just like, man, you're actually trying to put me up on a pedestal. And I think that when we do that, the only person that really belongs on a pedestal is Jesus. And if we really understand that and believe that, it frees us up to say all the places where we're not on pedestals and we actually aren't who we ought to be. And that's actually the strength of the gospel, is kind of that freedom to be honest, radically honest, but also radically hopeful. Like, it's not just giving into it and saying like, oh, okay, this is just what I am, my wayward heart. It's saying like, no, I believe that Jesus is going to do something with me, but I can start to be honest about who I am and what I'm about and what I'm struggling with. And what I have found personally is that in that honesty, that is actually where I've been most helpful to people that are broken. But religious people often don't want that. And that's fine. My ministry is more to people that have been, I would say, the unchurched, de-churched, burned by the church, pissed at the church, the people that have given up on church or have never been in church. Those are the folks that I feel called to minister to. And I find that me being willing to be honest about my story actually often provides a point of contact that is helpful.
Wow. In light of what you've shared already, and I take it that's quite a bit of the sermon that we've heard just now, what kind of response are you expecting to get?
Listen, I've been sharing this since I planted my first church. So one of the things I decided was that I was going to do ministry in a different way than I had seen it done, and I was going to be radically honest. And rather than focus on other people's sins, I was going to focus primarily on my sins and how God had actually helped me deal with those sins and become a different kind of person. So what I have seen over time is, well, first of all, the kind of people that I tend to connect with actually appreciate that. And I've shared the story many, it's hardest for my wife, because she's the one that really, if there's anybody who looks a lot like Jesus in this, it's my wife. So she has to sit there and listen to me share the story, listen to her lousy husband tell how lousy he is. At the same time, it's a story of, listen to how amazing Jesus is, that he can actually do something with lousy husbands. And everybody's lousy in some area. So I think that I'm not particularly worried about how people are going to respond, but it is really, really healthy in any church, we're actually working through our membership right now. So this is part of our membership stuff where I'm like, you need to know who I am as a pastor. You don't like log in and listen to some podcast and be like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. You know, there was this guy, Martin Purnell, and he like did all this research on the internet. It's like, no, they need to have heard it from me. And it's like, this is just going to be public record, guys, so that you're not surprised, but also so that you start to understand this is the kind of community that we're trying to create where it's safe to be radically honest. And that is remarkably rare in church communities. So at this point, I've been doing this for, 17 years, probably. So I'm not particularly concerned about like, what are people going to think? I've been through it enough times, but it is helpful for our people to be reminded of like, oh, if this is the kind of church that I am in, this kind of radical honesty, it's not required, but it's definitely encouraged. And we actually believe that the power of Jesus is manifested when we're honest as opposed to putting our best foot forward.
Mm. Well, let's lighten it a bit if that's all right. And maybe the next time that you come back, you can tell us about the plane crash. You know, I have logged that, but we'll move that for part 2, whenever part 2 is, if that's okay. The brewery then.
Yeah.
I have a cracking quote here, and perhaps you can link from this quote into why you went for a brewery. The quote is, if you can't go for a pint with your pastor, you have the wrong pastor.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that, please.
So basically, I went from software to seminary, just about blew up my marriage. And then I moved back to Montana to a city that is very, very post-Christian, and tried to plant a church for people that were not church people. And one of the things I realized was that in this very pagan community, one of the places where people were most honest was actually over beer. It was a small town of 80,000 people, which is pretty big in Montana, but it had 8 breweries. The breweries were where people gathered after work during the week. They'd gather, have a couple pints. Everybody talked, you'd meet people. And one of the things I observed was all of these people that I was meeting, first of all, I didn't tell them that I was a pastor, because you want to talk about a conversation, you know, it's just like, conversation's dead. So I got really good at asking lots of questions about people I'm meeting, and they'd be like, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, you'd never guess. It's really sketchy. Tell me more about you. And they're like, wait just a second. Eventually it would come out. But I observed people are honest over beer in a way that they are not honest in churches. 2, I observed that very few pastors, you've got all of these honest pagans who are willing to open up their lives very sincerely and share very deeply. And they're shocked to find a pastor hanging out drinking beer with them. They've been talking to me for an hour and they're like, you actually seem like a normal guy. Yeah. And it's like, why aren't more pastors in this space? And I realized a lot of pastors wouldn't be caught dead in that space, because what would people think about me? And in other words, it's primarily, first and foremost, about my reputation, my ministry, and I'm like, wow. And so it hit me. Listen, if you don't drink beer, I'm not saying you got to go have a beer, but the point is, people should be able to trust their pastors enough that they could actually be the kind of honest that you would have with a friend over a beer. And I realized most people in most churches that I've seen would never be that kind of honest with a pastor. It's not safe to do it. And most pastors aren't getting that kind of honesty from their people. And so it just really flows from this thing that I think, first and foremost, whatever we're going to do, we need to learn how to be more honest. And we need to have a platform for friendship. We say this all the time in our church. You don't have to share any of our convictions in order to be our friends. So you could disagree with me on everything, even Jesus. You could think I am crazy for believing in this guy from the Bible. Okay, that's fine. If you want to be my friend, I'll be friends with anybody. Most of us start by saying, I'm not going to have friendship with people unless they agree with me on things. And I think it's actually better to start and say, I'm going to be friends with anybody that wants to be friends. And so I think one of the places where friendship expresses itself, it's over coffee, it's over beer, it's over food. And it's in this kind of third space environment. And I'm just saying, I think that thing that we value among our friends, we should actually have that some kind of relationship among our spiritual mentors, our spiritual flock. And a lot of people, church is a completely different world from friendship. And I think that's not probably very healthy.
See, I've often said that you can be a really nice person 5 or 10 minutes before a church service starts, a really nice person 5 or 10 minutes after church service is finished. Same thing on a Bible study if you go to a Bible study on a Wednesday night. Mm-hmm. And people then get this impression that you must be a really, really nice person because they spent 5 minutes at a time with you, 10 minutes maybe tops in a week. You'll really turn this all around, I would have thought, by letting everyone come in. Mm-hmm. Tell me more, what you think.
Yeah, I mean, listen, like I cuss. I never used to cuss. I was so proud of how I didn't cuss. I spent most of my life not cussing and being very, very proud of how I didn't cuss. I didn't cuss until I became a church planner and started dealing with really broken people. And I started realizing and now I have a whole theology of cussing, but I probably cuss too much. But the point is, what I've learned as I've gotten older is most of the pastors and most of the people that I know in churches actually do cuss, but they do it outside. They'd never do it in a church. And to me, that just felt like I need to be the same person in the pulpit that I am the rest of the week. And if I can start to do that where my life is becoming integrated, so if you were a fly on the wall seeing me when nobody else is around, if my non-Christian friends see a different person, that's one of the biggest things they hate about Christians. It's hypocrisy. And one of the most winsome things about Christianity is that it actually gives us the resources to be the most authentic people, the most honest people, the most consistent people, even when nobody's looking. And so I've had lots of non-Christians who are like, that is compelling. And so I've just kind of said, I'm going to be this transparent person, or I'm going to try as much as I can. I'm going to try to be the same person in the pulpit as I am in my work week. And that's part of the reason, like, moving out of formal full-time pastoral ministry back into having a job has been really, really good for me. I think more pastors need to have jobs because it puts you into contact with ordinary people in ordinary space, in ordinary time. And it gives you a chance to know what the real world's like, but it gives them a chance to see what you're like in the real world.
That's very almost Fidel Castro-like. And the reason why I'm saying this...
I've never been compared to Fidel Castro before, but I do like cigars, so I will take that as a compliment.
Well, no, this is the reason why. But it's a classic story of Tony Campolo, and this is where I get Fidel Castro's story from, whereby Fidel Castro says when the Bay of Pigs finished and everything else like that, and he started to round up all the Catholic priests and carted them off to Spain, sent them back. He then called in all the Protestant ministers and said that you are welcome to stay, but if you stay, you have to go and work out in the fields, and then you can tend your flock at weekends. I'm happy you to tend your flock at weekends, but you have to tend to the fields the weekdays. So that's where I was getting like the Fidel Castro.
It. Well, I agree. I mean, I'm not a fan of Castro, but I am a fan of the idea of tending the fields during the week, having a job.
We've still got 2 more questions to go. The last question, of course, being, who is your Christian hero? It has to be dead, of course, and not anyone in the Bible. We've mentioned about the brewery. We've never really talked about it, and I'm so glad we haven't, because this podcast, yet again, has been so much more than just talking about beer, even though it's one of my favourite subjects, as is yours. Mm-hmm. Tell me more about your brewery, what it means to you, and what it does, please, besides making beer.
When I planted my first church, we spent 7 years, and we set out to plant a church for people that were not church people. I am a Presbyterian minister. I like being Presbyterian, but most of the people we connected with are not Presbyterian. Totally fine. I'm interested in helping people become Christians, not Presbyterians. But one of the things that happened in the first church plant was, first, it went very slowly. Most of the people that we were connecting with are what I would call post-Christian. They're very wary of the church. They've got lots of good evidence for why the church, why Christianity must be false. And it's Christians, and it's churches, and they have a valid point. At the same time, a lot of what they perceive to be Christianity is really what I would call like religious Christendom. In other words, it's more the trappings of Christianity or just genuine religion. The problem with that is if you say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus, they're like, look, I know all about Jesus. I went to Sunday school when I was a kid. I've heard all this stuff. I know about grace. They think they know what all this stuff is, and you can't just tell them they don't know it. You have to live in a way that deconstructs what they think, and that's very slow. So a lot of people that I would know, it might be 3 or 4 years before they ever even walked in the door of our church, if they ever got to that point. I started a couple of realizations. One, the church grew very slowly. Two, in Christendom-style churches, which is what most of our churches are. And by that I mean Christendom is dominant culture, church is respectable, lots of people want to be there, and they've got money, and what they expect are buildings, budgets, staffs, things like that, programming. Well, in that model of ministry where you have full-time pastors, that's very expensive. It takes a lot of money. And if the people you are trying to reach are very, very slow in coming, it's going to be very, very expensive. And so we had planted this church, and I was actually starting to hear, 85% of our folks didn't come from another church. We probably had 30 conversions. We had another 30, 40 people that probably would have said, I feel like I'm becoming a Christian. I believe this stuff all my life, but it's becoming new and fresh to me now in a way that it feels almost like I'm becoming a Christian all over again, which was how I felt when I really started to understand grace, when my wife was gracious to me, and like that kind of, the shoe dropped. But so over 7 years, we had a church that was 80 people, 90 people, and it wasn't really self-sustaining. And I was hearing people in my own tribe, my Presbyterian tribe, who were like kind of through the grapevine, nobody would say it directly, we love the fact that you're reaching non-Christians, but it's too slow. You need to go after church people from other churches because they'll become elders faster and they'll give money faster. And I was just like, man, that is not what I feel called to. So I felt a deep sense of calling to continue to minister to these people that I would call like post-Christian people. And that's slow. And yet you look at early Christianity, pre-Christian, pre-Christendom, and you find they didn't have budgets. They didn't have many full-time pastors. They didn't have buildings. And yet Christianity exploded. And so I was like, maybe we could learn something from pre-Christendom that might be helpful in post-Christendom. And that was when I started thinking about what would it be like to actually have a job? Let's change our model. And a job that would embed me permanently in public space, because church has a way of sucking you in. So when we started planting that church, all my relationships were outside the church. But by the time we were 5 years in and the church is 50, 60 people, everybody's saying, feed me, feed me. And you're spending all your time with church folks. So we had started a nonprofit in the community that was not a religious nonprofit. It just helped people help each other. And that thing actually blew up. We had probably 700 volunteers. It was far larger than my church was. There was no way, the church couldn't even afford to pay me, really, let alone hire somebody to run this nonprofit. So we needed a fundraiser. And I thought, our church was called All Souls. And I'm like, it'd be a great fundraiser to have a beer called All Souls Ale. That'd be a good beer name. And so I got a meeting with a local brewery, and I sat down with this guy, and I'm like, hey, I'm a pastor. I'm not here to pitch my church, but I'd like you to brew a beer. I'd like you to call it All Souls Ale. And I'd like you to give all the profits to this nonprofit. And there was a long silence. And he said, nobody's ever asked me to do this before, let alone a church. He's like, everybody wants free beer or free money, but nobody's ever done like a partnership thing. Wow. And he said, I know Christians used to do this, and, like they used to be connected to beer. He's like, let's do it. We brewed a beer called All Souls Ale. It was an 11% Imperial Saison. It was amazing. And you had a church partnering with a brewery to fund a nonprofit in a pagan community. And the community loved it. And every time I would get together with the owner of that brewery, for 5 years we did this, he would talk about God. He never came to our church, but he would talk about God. And he'd talk about all his hurts and struggles. And then he'd be like, Christian, you need to start a brewery. And I'm like, I'm a pastor. He'd be like, I don't go to church anymore. I gave up on that, but I know my brewing history. pastors used to do this. And he meant the monks and the nuns and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I had been ministering for almost 7 years. And I was like, okay, I think I really would like to try to plant another church, but to do it where I have a job in the community that can support me and sustain me, and that the community can appreciate, even if they don't share any of my convictions about Jesus. And I'm like, what kind of job would that? And I'm like, man, I really like coffee and I really like beer. I think I'm going to start a brewery. And he's like, yes. So that was kind of the major milestone where we left Montana and came to Austin, Texas, to see if I could start a brewery and start another church, both at the same time, both from scratch, which is absolutely insane. But we did it, and here we are. And so now we have 2 breweries and a church that meets in my house. And I'm kind of living in both of these worlds now, and I work all week long.
Amazing. And for those that want to know more about your brewery, no doubt there's a website. He says in brackets, knowingly.
LazarusBrewing.com.
LazarusBrewing.com. And you say you've got 2 breweries.
Basically, I have 2 locations. It's a brew pub. We've actually won a number of awards. We've been very, very successful. We've been very well received in a city like Austin. We have 2 locations, and God willing, there may be more down the road. I've learned that a lot of what I'm doing is not just creating coffee, and my wife roasts all the coffee. We do probably about 1,250 barrels of beer a year at each location. So 2,500 barrels a year between the 2 locations, all on premise. It's a lot of hospitality. We do coffee, we do beer, we do tacos, and I have about 70 employees now. Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. Well, listen, thank you so much for sharing all this. It's brilliant. And I'll tell you what, those that are listening today and thinking, well, our church, we need to make money. Well, here you go. You don't have to open your own brewery, but why don't you think of what you like? Maybe you like washing up. Well, find if there's a manufacturer that can make washing up liquid or something and see if you can broker a deal. It could be anything. It's a great encouragement with what you've been sharing there. Christian, we've run out of time now, and it just comes to the final question, if that's okay. And at the very end, if people want to contact you, perhaps you can give an address as well, please. Christian Cryder, who is your Christian hero, please?
So if it's not somebody from the Bible, I'm a big fan of Paul. I'm a big fan of Peter. I'm a big fan of Jesus. I really, really like Augustine.
Oh.
I'm just a big fan of Augustine. I love his honesty. He is pushing people in the direction of the gospel. I really appreciate Confessions, the book that first memoir, really in the history of humanity. Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Augustine.
What do we know about him?
You know, Augustine lived late 300s into early 400. Augustine was the first person really that was like actually writing about his spiritual journey. He was very, very sharp. He was very well educated. He was trained, he was a scholar, he was embedded in pagan religions, and he's like, these are not answering the big questions of my life. And yet he's very clear that he didn't like think his way to Christianity. He talks about how God met him. Just reading the book Confessions is good. I just appreciate, you have this very educated, learned, big thinker who is absolutely using his brain at all of its horsepower. And yet he's still really down to earth preaching to his people. And he understands this is hard for you to get. I'm going to try again next week. Augustine is somebody that the more I read of him, I go, that guy, I would love to sit down and have a beer with him. So now I've got other Christian heroes as well. If you said modern, more modern, I've been really influenced by a guy named Tim Keller out of New York City. So a lot of my theology of both my understanding of the gospel, my understanding of grace, and then my understanding of city. Like, why did I move to Austin? Because I wanted to be a part of a world-class city. And I think cities shape culture. And if we want to reach our culture, we've got to figure out how to reach our cities. Mm-hmm. If I can't do this in a place like Austin, I would like to see if I can do this in a place like Austin. And so that's what we're doing. And we're, laboring, but in a small way. I'm not under any illusions that we're going to change the world or anything like that. But we might make a difference here in our neighborhood. And so that's really what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much for what you shared. I said right at the very beginning, I didn't know where we're going to end up on this.
Yeah.
Look where we've ended up. For those that want to get in touch with you, hopefully to encourage you and say thank you rather than, oh, you can't drink alcohol and all that sort of stuff. How can they contact you, please?
Christian@lazarusbrewing.com. Or you could go to, I've got a website, ChristianCryder.com. Yeah, either one of those. If you search for me, you can find me. There's all sorts of sketchy stuff, out there. Yeah, so we've got Lazarus Brewing, and then our church here in Austin is All Souls Church of Austin. It's a little house church. More than happy to answer questions via email and stuff like that.
And in part 2, whenever we do it, along with the plane crash, we've got a CD to talk about. That's for part 2. Christian, thank you so much for your time. It's been incredible. Thanks so much for
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Martin.
Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
I went to the Archbishop of Brisbane, knocked on his door, and I said, Your Grace, what are you going to do about all these parishes where there's no people in the churches? And I was sitting in Mass on Sunday, and there was hardly any men, and it was mostly women, and most of them had grey hair. And your listeners will probably laugh when you hear that, like you did, because it's the same congregations that you guys are in. They're mostly women with grey hair and a few men, at least in the mainstream churches. And I said, what are you going to do about it, Your Grace? It's a disgrace, Your Grace. I said, where are all the men? And he looked at me like, I've had some interesting characters in my office, but here's this one. He said, no, Robert, I'm not going to do anything about it. You're going to do it. Go away and do something, and in a year's time, come back and tell me what you've done. So I started Men Alive.
Author and co-founder of Men Alive, based in Australia, Robert Fulson. Until then, cheerio.